Hey guys, what's up? It's me, Thomas. Today we're back here with Extra History, part 2 of the William McKinley series called Imperial President. So, yeah, this is basically where Americans become known as imperialists with our own colonies. So, yeah, there is all this. So, let me hop in. Considering last time we actually saw his rise into politics, to become the president. So, let's see how his term goes. Be sure to like, subscribe for more. Hope you enjoy. Let's go.
We now return to the World's Fair in Buffalo, New York, September 5th, 1901. After his speech of trade policy is complete, President William McKinley embarks on a tour of the World's Fair. This year, it has a very specific focus. It's the Pan-American Exposition,
There it is.
celebrating the explosion of the American continent, and especially the United States, onto the world stage. For McKinley strolling through this with his entourage, it is a celebration of his own role in that emergence. The buildings are in Spanish colonial style, recalling the former Spanish possessions the United States now holds. The Native American chief Geronimo is displayed as a live exhibit near a reconstructed
Geronimo?
Native American village, recalling the last American conquest. And eventually he stops at the building representing Puerto Rico to have a coffee with the Latin American commissioners. Here in this exposition, his territorial acquisitions look congenial. They are not. Across the planet, in the Philippines, American generals are herding civilians into disease-filled concentration camps in order to create free fire zones and burning their homes so rebel insurgents cannot use them. And within weeks, 54 U.S. Army soldiers will be ambushed and killed by guerrillas while eating. In return, an American officer will organize a reprisal attack on Samar Island, ordering his soldiers to kill any male over the age of 10. At least 2,000 die, most of them civilians.
Yikes.
McKinley laughs. A cup clinks a saucer. He has 24 hours to live.
Yeah, remember, that anarchist is still waiting about.
This headline-making episode is
Ground
brought
News.
to you by Ground News, my personal go-to for navigating today's chaotic media landscape, and who we thank for supporting today's historical tale. On March 4th, 1897, William McKinley took the oath of office as a disgruntled and uncomfortable Grover Cleveland looked on.
Sorry, Grover.
And the outgoing president had reason for discomfort, even beyond his severe gout, because the Democrats had suffered a drubbing in the election of 1896, one big enough to change politics at the national level for decades. Since before the Civil War, Republicans and Democrats had controlled roughly equal blocks, creating close elections and a presidency that regularly changed hands. Yet the election of 1896 ushered in a new era, one where Republicans would largely dominate national elections. In fact, Woodrow Wilson would be the only Democratic president between 1896 and FDR's New Deal coalition in 1932. And McKinley did tackle the tariffs and monetary issues he'd run on. But we're going to talk about all of that in the next episode. Because as often happens with presidents, the issues McKinley ran on would not define his presidency. Instead, his first term would largely be about foreign policy, a topic that got only minor attention during the campaign. And while your high school history textbook might claim this was thrust upon him as a result of the Spanish-American War, that is not totally accurate. Because McKinley's first move was not in the Caribbean or the Philippines, but on the independent kingdom of Hawaii. And I know I sound like a broken record when I say this should be its own series, but to put it in terms we have time for here, in 1893, a group of foreign-born businessmen and Hawaiian-born American citizens overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy with the help of a rogue U.S. diplomat and a party of U.S. Marines. One of the instigating factors of that was, ironically, the 1890 McKinley tariffs. See, in 1875, the Hawaiian Kingdom had signed a reciprocity treaty with the United States, allowing Hawaiian sugar to enter the U.S. duty-free. But since the McKinley tariffs dropped all duties on sugar imports, Hawaii's largest export suddenly had no competitive advantage, plunging the kingdom into a financial crisis. That spurned Queen Liliuokalani to propose a new constitution, which provided an excuse for the coup and made business leaders eager to join the U.S. to avoid tariffs. So, losing no...
Yeah, this sounds more like they just didn't want to pay up, and they're like, might as well join the U.S. They can't, charge us then. At least that's how I see it, and sorry for calling the king like that. I saw KK, I was like, oh. Anyway.
Time after the overthrow, the coup plotters immediately organized a provisional government in order to lobby for U.S. annexation. But the overthrow happened essentially between presidential administrations, after Grover Cleveland had won the election, but Benjamin Harrison was still in charge. So when the request for annexation arrived in Washington, Harrison sent it to Congress, hoping to push it through, but as soon as Cleveland was inaugurated, he withdrew support. In fact, he withdrew a lot more than that. He forced the diplomat to resign and ordered an investigation which concluded that U.S. forces had acted illegally and recognizing the Hawaiian Kingdom as the rightful government, a position he took a lot of heat for. But because Cleveland was serving his second non-consecutive term, the coup plotters knew they could just wait him out. So they formed a republic under pineapple magnate and coup plotter Sanford B. Dole to wait for a more friendly administration. And they got it in McKinley, who considered Hawaiian annexation a bit of unfinished business. Given that by the time the provisional government had both gained international recognition and forced Queen Liliuokalani to abdicate, he drafted a treaty in the summer of 1897 to annex Hawaii. Yet it failed in Congress twice. See, annexation was a controversial thing among Americans, and McKinley couldn't get the two-thirds majority required to bring Hawaii in, though events quickly changed that sentiment. In 1895, a rebellion broke out against the Spanish Empire in Cuba. This wasn't a new thing, really, so much as a continuation of an uprising that had begun in 1868, then temporarily ceased a decade later when the Spanish government promised reforms, then failed to deliver on them. When the rebellion restarted, the Spanish government flooded Cuba with troops, deploying 200,000 men and fighting a brutal counterinsurgency that aimed to starve the rebels of both supplies and their civilian support. Their main tactic was to separate the civilians from the rebels, forcing them to relocate to Spanish-controlled territory, then destroying their fields, homes, and livestock so they could not be used by the rebels. Ain't
that what the United States would have done? Like, that's what we saw in the intro, you know? Push them into, American land, reprisals for counterattacks, and, burning their land so the rebels couldn't use it. That does sound like what was going on in the earlier bits, wasn't it? Odd. Just one imperialist to another. Ouch.
Displaced civilians were moved into what the Spanish called re-concentration camps, which became known in the US media as concentration camps. And yes, that is where we got that term. These camps were horrific, and within the first few years, roughly 100,000 Cubans interned there had died from starvation and disease. This horrified both Congress and the American public, which increasingly favored U.S. intervention both on humanitarian grounds and in support of revolutionary freedom. And during the campaign of 1896, both parties had expressed support for the Cuban rebels, but to McKinley, that was different than a full-on military intervention. Unlike the expansionist faction of his Republican Party, McKinley was no warmonger, because unlike many of his contemporaries, he'd personally experienced heavy combat and knew how atrocious war could be. If he could avoid the conflict, he would. So while calls for war grew in the newspapers, in Congress, and in his own cabinet, he tried to exhaust diplomatic avenues and issue ultimatums. However, these weren't mere words. He also positioned American fleets in Hong Kong to threaten Spain's most lucrative possession, the Philippine Islands, and at the end of January 1898, sent one of America's newest and most impressive warships, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor. 3 weeks later, on February 15th, the USS Maine exploded for unknown reasons, killing 261 men out of a crew of 355. Now, the cause of the explosion remains unclear, though modern investigations generally attribute it to high concentrations of combustible dust in the ship's coal bunker, which then set off its forward magazines. However, other evidence does suggest a mine could have been to blame. But in 1898, government inquiries definitively ruled the explosion to have been due to an external mine, and the call of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain" echoed across newspapers. Media titans such as William Randolph Hearst pressed for action. Still, McKinley tried to avoid it, leading Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, to quip that the president, quote, "has the backbone of a chocolate eclair." But not all were calling for war. In fact, there was a significant anti-imperialist faction in both Congress and the public, made up of prominent voices like Mark Twain, Grover Cleveland, and McKinley's popular opponent, William Jennings Bryan. Now, in a reversal of what you might expect, it was generally the more conservative voices in the country that opposed imperial ambitions. Progressives, people who tended to favor expanding African American rights and worker protections, were the ones rooting for America to acquire territory for the purpose of economic expansion, great power jockeying, and Christianization. Whereas conservatives called on older ideals of the American Republic, embodied by George Washington's farewell speech, which warned against turning the Republic into an expansionist empire. To do so, they argued, was to go against American values and risk the country's legitimacy, both as a republic and a champion of freedom. I mean, what would the world think if the US freed Cuba from Spain, only to become its new master? Now, you could argue that the US had already been extremely expansionist in the era of Manifest Destiny, but at the time, both sides of the political aisle considered that westward push to be natural and logical. This action would be pushing beyond what they considered America. Finally, reluctantly, McKinley asked Congress to give him the power to declare war. Congress said yes, but anti-imperialists added the Teller Amendment, stating that the United States could not establish permanent control over Cuba. And so began a conflict that McKinley's Secretary of State referred to as, quote, a splendid little war. It was over almost before it began. In the first move of the war, America moved its modernized fleet from Hong Kong to Manila Harbor and confronted the Spanish, the result of which was only a battle in the academic sense. Once Commodore Dewey gave his now famous order, "You may fire when ready," the U.S. Navy annihilated their Spanish opponents with powerful long-range fire. The Spanish were reduced to trying and failing to ram the U.S. vessels. The entire Spanish fleet was sent to the bottom of the bay, with 77 killed and 271 wounded. The Americans reportedly lost one man who died of a heart attack. It was a victory.
Wow. Can you imagine that? Just who was like, wow, you actually did great. Not sure that's the ship, or just me showing you may fire when ready. Still, I mean, who has heard that line, you know? I mean, you gotta admit, that's a pretty catchy line. No wonder it stuck around. Anyway.
So total that it took American military and political leaders off guard. The last time the U.S. had fought a European power had been 1812, and that was extremely tough going. Could it really be this easy? Emboldened, Dewey realized that with the Spanish fleet gone and most enemy troops deployed in Cuba, the Philippines was open for the taking. And while the Teller Amendment did bar the U.S. from taking over Cuba, you know, it didn't say anything about the Philippines or, you know, any other Spanish possessions. Quickly, an American cruiser seized the island of Guam, while another force snatched up Puerto Rico, which it should be noted Spain had actually made autonomous and was suffering none of the humanitarian abuses the U.S. military was supposedly invading to stop. Meanwhile, in Cuba, troops moved into Santiago, where Theodore Roosevelt captured the media spotlight with his Rough Riders at the Battle of San Juan Hill. McKinley, for his part, was no passive observer either. For the first time, modern telecommunications allowed the White House to become a war room. He used telephones, telegraph, and signals broadcasts to keep abreast of war events across the Caribbean and the Pacific and communicate with commanders. But the effort did drive him to exhaustion in the 4 months of active fighting and 3 months of treaty negotiations afterward. One particular issue in negotiations was the fate of the Philippines, by far Spain's most lucrative colonial possession. Initially, McKinley wanted Manila Bay to serve as an American naval and trading outpost, but in order to defend it, they needed the whole island of Luzon, and in order to defend that, the whole archipelago. Yet taking it risked a possible betrayal on several levels. First, setting up a colony could be seen as a betrayal of American principles. Second, it could be seen as a betrayal of their Philippine allies. When the U.S. had invaded, the Philippine revolutionary leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, returned from exile in Hong Kong to help rally troops to fight alongside the Americans. In a meeting with Commodore Dewey, Alginaldo claimed Dewey promised independence in exchange for the Philippine guerrillas aiding U.S. troops. Dewey, by contrast, claimed he said no such thing. But whatever the truth, it could be perceived as going back on their word. On the other hand, the Philippines offered the U.S. access to lucrative Asian markets, and Hawaii, whose annexation passed due to war enthusiasm and a sneaky congressional maneuver that required only a simple majority, was a perfect way station. Meanwhile, as McKinley deliberated, he was informed that both Germany and Japan had designs on the Philippines, particularly the Germans, who had sent a fleet there as, quote, military observers. Now that the U.S. had the Philippines, would it not be better to take possession of it rather than release it to be fought over by the great powers? Later, McKinley would tell a White House visitor a story of him pacing the halls late one night, unsure of what to do with the Philippines, praying for wisdom. But then suddenly, it came upon him that the only moral thing to do with these possessions, these islands that had fallen into his lap, would be to paternalistically raise the people of the Philippines up, give them instruction in their own self-government, and ensure that if they had a ruler, it would be a benevolent nation like the United States. He also wanted to Christianize the population, which is odd considering they were already heavily Catholic. McKinley didn't know a lot about these islands, to be honest. Even so, he ordered that his diplomats begin negotiating for the Philippines as well as Puerto Rico and Guam. And they'd get it. In the Treaty of Paris, the United States only had to pay Spain $20 million to compensate it for the infrastructure. America had its empire, as well as a guerrilla war in the Philippines, which would carry on for 3 years and kill between 100,000 and 200,000 Filipinos, and see the United States use the exact same tactics of reconcentration camps and indiscriminate violence they'd condemned the Spanish for in Cuba. But McKinley wasn't done with the world, not by a long shot, for his next move would be on China. And we are going to cover...
Yeah, there is one more to go. The anarchist president. Yeah, there is one more shot, but we'll get there next time, I promise. Till then, thanks for watching, guys. See ya.